Hey guys, today I'm talking about boundaries and I want to know if this resonates with you. Okay, so when you get a chance, let me know in the description box below. But you probably learned about boundaries and the importance of having boundaries in healthy relationships. And on a logical level, you get it. Like you completely agree that boundaries are healthy, that you have every right to have boundaries, and that you want to put them into place in your life, right? Logically. But when you go to put down the boundary, one of two things happens, okay? Either one, you get so uncomfortable that you start feeling a tremendous amount of fear as to what's going to happen if you put down this boundary. And these emotions of dread just start flooding your body to the point that it's almost like you can't, like something within you kicks on and prevents you from putting down that boundary. Or you have to really reach into your trauma responses and you wind up having to activate your fight response so intensely that you fling into fight, and putting down the boundary makes you or brings out in you your worst. Okay, so in other words, you either can't put the boundary down because it's just bringing up too much fear, or you feel like you become a jerk. Okay, if that resonates with you, first of all, let me know. But more importantly, you're going to want to watch this video. For those that don't know me, my name is Michelle. I'm super passionate about helping people through narcissistic abuse recovery as well as Cptsd recovery. I'm also the founder of the Thriver School of Transformation, which is a monthly membership where we meet live on Zoom and we work through the side effects of both of those things together. Here's the link for anyone that wants to check it out. Okay, so let's get into that, because eventually, if we want to have healthy relationships, we have to be able to put down boundaries. Okay, boundaries are what help us to teach people how to treat us, and they're also what protects us from behaviors that we don't want to tolerate. Now, the additional challenge is if you're trying to put them down with controlling parents or controlling people in your life, possibly narcissistic, right? I can't diagnose anybody. So let's just say that they're controlling people. How do you put down boundaries when you're feeling either of those two scenarios that take place when you want to put down a boundary? So I first want to kind of explain and normalize what's happening inside of you. And I feel like it's important to understand, because I know in my case, when I didn't understand why I couldn't do it, why it was so challenging, why I felt like a child when I knew logically I am an adult and I'm allowed to have boundaries. Why was I feeling so childlike? Why was I feeling that fear as if I was going to be punished or in trouble, or as if that suddenly, if somebody was upset with my boundary, that somehow that meant that I was bad, like a bad person? None of that made sense on a conscious, logical level, but emotionally, that's what was going on inside. So when I didn't understand it, it's like it just kept happening and repeating, and I couldn't do anything about it, because obviously we can't work through something or heal something that we don't understand. So normalizing it, okay? If you were raised in a dynamics in childhood where you were not allowed to be you, where you were not allowed to have boundaries, right? You weren't allowed to have physical boundaries. I know in my coaching practice, I get a lot of people that say that their narcissistic parents, the boundaries or the lack of boundaries was just insane. Some of them refused to let their children, and these are older children, sometimes young adult children living at home, they weren't allowed to close the doors to their bedroom. They weren't allowed to close the doors in the bathroom. They weren't allowed to have any kind of emotional privacy, and they weren't allowed to object to anything that the narcissist wanted to do, even if it meant encroaching on boundaries that made them feel uncomfortable. So if you grew up in an environment where that's what you lived, where you were not allowed to have your own boundaries, and on top of it, not only were you not allowed, but if you tried to have boundaries, you were severely punished, emotionally abandoned, and or verbally abused, then that puts a dent in your nervous system. Okay, a lot of recovery from narcissistic abuse and complex PTSD is working through the dents in the nervous system that are the result of what happened in childhood. So what happens is that in childhood, when you were punished for having a boundary, right, that created pain in you, that created feelings of rejection, abandonment, anger, sadness, frustration. A lot of strong emotions would come up as a result of that treatment. But you had nobody to go to say, look, I'm feeling this, and have that person validate your feelings and help you through that. You didn't have that in childhood. So you were going through this behavior, right, from your parents that was wrong, and it was creating strong emotions, and you had nobody to help you to process these strong emotions. So what do? You suppress. You can't share it with the toxic parent, because if you say, look, this is hurting my feelings, that you're not allowing me to do this normal activity, because simply by having your feelings hurt by their actions, which in their mind, they're perfect, right? So how dare you not like anything that they're saying or any rules that they're imposing on you? You can't do that. You're shamed even more for even being upset. So the emotions are there and they're suppressed. You survive your childhood, right? And one of the ways we survived a childhood like that was by suppressing. Those feelings were too strong for a child to work through. So we suppress them. We tend to think that children are resilient, right? And, they can make it through. Well, yeah, we physically survived those circumstances. But what is out of sight does not mean it's out of mind. And what was suppressed stays in your nervous system. And your nervous system is like a surveillance, a 24/7 surveillance, right? And it's always looking for anything that slightly resembles what caused you to suppress those emotions in the first place. And that could be many things, but for the sake of this video, we're talking about boundaries. So what happens? Well, now you're at work, and you notice that because of your lack of boundaries, the workload is getting tossed on you. It's getting higher and higher and higher, to the point that you feel like you're going to have a nervous breakdown, because you just don't have any time to just kind of recuperate and have any time for yourself. But you go to put down the boundary, and that your nervous system, that surveillance kicks on, and it notices the action of putting down a boundary, and it makes an assumption of what happened in the past. And what's basically taking place is what you suppress and put out of mind in childhood, your nervous system, because it's noticing a similarity, it's putting the two together. And this is what we call an emotional flashback. But what happens in an emotional flashback is that your brain confuses past and present. So you feel the dread, the fear, the abandonment, the anxiety, the loneliness, the rejection that you suppressed in childhood. You feel it coming up in your body, and it feels as if the exact same way you felt at that young age is what's happening in your body. And so you're feeling it from almost like a child mind side of it. And when that happens, when you're in the middle of an emotional flashback like that, where you feel those feelings of dread, those feelings of fear that you felt in childhood, when you're in an emotional flashback, the left side of your brain goes offline. Brain scans have shown that when somebody is in a flashback, the right side, or the emotional side, the fear center side of the person's brain, is lit up like fireworks. And the left side is black. There's no activity in the logical side of your brain, which is why at that moment, right, you come from that fear center and you act from that fear center, and you act from that child mind like way of being that If I put down this boundary, I'm going to get in trouble. I'm going to get punished. That means I'm a bad person. All of the things that were dented in your nervous system in childhood, those are the only things you have access to at that moment of a flashback. And it's why after it takes place and after you're out of the flashback, you can look back. You can look back when your logic is kicked back on and you can be like, why didn't I? Like, it doesn't make any sense. Well, it doesn't now because your left brain is back online. But at that moment, it's not. Okay, so what's happening is you're going through an emotional flashback. What the boundaries that you're wanting to put down are triggering your unhealed wounds that took place when you tried to have boundaries in childhood. So long story short, in order to have boundaries in the present, in order to put them down in work relationships, in friendships, in romantic relationships, we have to heal those unhealed wounds. That's the CPTSD recovery part of this process. We can't just leave the past in the past because it stays alive in your nervous system. And your nervous system activates parts of your brain that override your conscious thinking. Okay, so in order to not go to that side where you shut down and you don't put that boundary down, you have to be able to work through the emotional flashbacks. And that takes time. It takes working through past trauma. It takes learning to resolve the things that you have to suppress. So let's talk about the other extreme. The other extreme is you want to put that boundary down, but you feel like you have to be a jerk in order to get people to respect your boundaries. I hear this so often where people say, Michele, I know my boundaries and my family, they're toxic, but I don't want them out of my life. I want to have relationships with my family members, but I want to have boundaries so that I can have these relationships without getting sucked into toxic encounters with them and without feeling so horrible, by the relationship, which, by the way, anyone that chooses to have relationships with family members that are like that, that's a personal decision and no one should judge that. Everyone has their reasons. Everyone has their own personal circumstance. There's not a one way for everyone. Go no contact. That might be your thing and that might have saved your life and that you may feel strongly about that for yourself, and that's wonderful. But I'm a big believer in meeting people where they're at and allowing people to make their personal decisions in regards to the relationship they want to have with their family members. Okay, so in this case, I'm talking about people that are maybe in a romantic relationship. Maybe it's a long-term marriage. Maybe it's with their parents. And for whatever reason, they can't or don't want to be out of those relationships. Okay, if you want to have boundaries and you find yourself flinging over to the side of losing all control, and then obviously having that used against you, then I want to talk about that for a couple of minutes, okay? The most powerful thing that helped me in those situations was changing my mindset, okay? In other words, once I learned that boundaries are normal, which is quite sad to have to be an adult and learn that, but it is what it is, right? So once I learned that boundaries are normal and that I was allowed to have them, and I wanted to start putting them down, what happens when you try to put boundaries down with individuals that don't respect boundaries? Are they like, oh, wow, Michele, that's such a healthy behavior. I totally support and respect you. No. To them, a boundary is like, ooh, this is something I can do that can frustrate Michele and get her agitated, and I could soak up that energy. So they view boundaries as something to cross, not something to respect. Understanding that is the first step. Okay, just because you know that you are allowed to have boundaries and that you can put them down doesn't automatically mean that people are going to see it the same way as you. They're still going to be them. There's still going to be people that always look for ways to cross your boundaries and always look for ways to poke you so that you wind up giving them a negative emotional reaction. So let go of getting them to see it your way. That's step one for that mindset. Step two in changing my mindset was learning that putting down boundaries doesn't mean other people are happy, and that that's okay. We tend to think, and this comes from our upbringing, right? We tend to think that if we put down a behavior or if we act in a certain way and somebody's happy with us, then that's good. But if somebody is upset or disappointed with us, then we somehow think that we did something wrong. No, no, that's not true. People are allowed to be upset. People are allowed to be disappointed. People are allowed to be frustrated with you. And that is not a reflection on who you are as a person. And it's not a reflection on if you're doing the right thing or not. Now think about it. Because if you think like that, basically everything that you do has to get a stamp of approval from someone outside of self. That means everything you do is dependent on how someone else feels. That's a very disempowering way to be. Because what if that person is always unhappy and disappointed with you unless you are completely sacrificing you for them? Okay, that's something that in childhood you may have done because that was a survival skill. But in adulthood, it's only going to keep you, being mistreated. Okay, so you get that mindset. That's the first thing to have in place. The second thing to have in place is to know what you have to do to enforce your boundary. It's not enough to have a boundary. It's not enough to tell somebody your boundary. Sometimes we think, I'm going to tell my boundary. I'm going to call up my mom and I'm going to tell her, this is my boundary. And we think we have to tell them. Now, if those are healthy relationships, then telling people your boundary is wonderful. But if they are unhealthy relationships and the person you want to tell is somebody that never listens to you and never sees your perspective, you're going to spend a lot of energy trying to get through to somebody that is intentionally not wanting to listen or hear you. So rather than having to tell somebody your boundary, you simply show them. So for example, let's say you do tell your narcissistic parent that you no longer will be engaging in conversations where there's yelling, screaming, insults, and just disrespectful behavior. Okay, you tell them that. And what happens the next time you're talking? They do something that they always do. They disrespect, they raise their voice, they insult. You have two choices at that moment. You can try to convince them and defend yourself and explain, which, by the way, which may be tempting to do. And I know we tend to get in the beginning of healing and learning these and learning how to implement these healthy behaviors. That's a temptation because there's still a tiny piece of you that might think, if I can just get through, they'll understand and then everything will be wonderful. No, it's not going to work. So that is a choice, but it's only going to result in you losing energy and continuing in the same patterns of tolerating the abuse and the disrespect. Or you can enforce the boundary. Now, in my case, I'll tell you how I learned to do this, and maybe this will open up perspectives for your personal situation. So there were certain topics that I didn't want to engage in with a certain person that I felt was very high on the scale of malignant narcissism. Okay, so yes, I did say, look, this topic is off limits. And what happened? It's so funny when you tell a narcissist, don't do this. It's like they can't wait to try and see what happens when they do. So that's exactly what happened. This person started talking about it. And that's when it was in my power to empower myself. And this is what I would do without being a jerk. I'd be like, oh, you know what? I know I'm interrupting you, but I got to make a quick phone call. I'll talk to you a little bit later, ... And I'd be on my phone and completely just getting out of that conversation. Now, I did that when I was in the car, and they love to do things in the car, right? When you're in the car with them, they love to do things to push your buttons because you can't go anywhere. But that's what I would do. And I would literally make a phone call, and just for the rest of the ride, it was impossible to go back towards that topic. And I didn't get angry with this person. I didn't allow myself to look frustrated or feel frustrated. In fact, I wasn't frustrated because I was proud of myself for enforcing the boundary. Rather than focusing on, this person didn't respect the boundary, they never respect the boundary, and every time I didn't let my mind stare at that. I let my mind stare at, wow, Michele, look at how easily you were able to shift. And wow, look, you're enjoying this conversation with so-and-so. And look, even though you're stuck in the car, a place where this would often take place, look at how much in control you are. I would stare at that, and my energy would be so positive that they got no supply from me. And it wasn't about faking it. It was about really focusing on what allowed me to feel empowered. Okay. When I would be on the phone with this person and they would try it at those times, I would just be like, oh, you know what? I got another call. Oh, I'm so sorry. I have to go to the bathroom. Gotta go. Nice talking to you. Bye. Now, some of you might be thinking, but Michele, that's weak. You should tell them, and you should call them out for their behavior. Well, if that particular person that I'm discussing, if that particular person was a reasonable person, I totally agree with you. But to try to call out a person like that is to put myself in a disempowered position where I am trying to explain color to a blind person. Okay. And I'm going to be giving a tremendous amount of energy, and all that energy that I'm putting in to explain, that person's like soaking it up. So it's not weak. There's actually more strength in allowing yourself to be in an empowered position than a disempowered one trying to convince. When we're trying to convince somebody, that's not an empowered place. It doesn't feel good. Okay. So notice, I didn't have to do it with anger because it's not my personality. We want to enforce boundaries that are in alignment with our best self. And if we start doing it with anger, and if we start flying off the handle, we're giving that energy. They're soaking up that narcissistic supply, and we don't feel empowered that way. So it's about finding ways that you can put down that boundary in a way that allows you to feel proud of yourself and empowered. Okay. So if you're struggling with this, the first thing I would recommend is really learning how to work through emotional flashbacks and doing some work on working through unhealed wounds from the past. That's the first step. The second step is to start looking at how you can enforce the boundary. Not that you are going to tell the person or that you have the boundary, but how can you enforce it when, not if, when they try to cross it. And what you can start doing is just imagine yourself putting down that boundary. Imagine yourself being able to do it in your mind, visualizing it, because now you're putting down the neural pathways that you need to be able to do it. So that in the moment that you are in that situation where this person is crossing your boundary, you can put down that you can enforce your boundary. And then remind yourself, it's okay if they're mad. It's okay if they're disappointed. It's okay if they're irritated. They're allowed to have whatever emotions they choose to have. Give them the permission that they never gave you. They never let you have permission for your own feelings. And sometimes we can get intertwined in that way of thinking. Okay, so we want to give them permission. If they want to have those emotions, we don't like those emotions, but that's their choice, right? You're still allowed to be you. So I hope this video helps anybody that is wanting to put down boundaries with difficult people without having to fling all the way into acting in a way that makes you not proud of the way you're being. And again, if you feel like you can use some weekly support, make sure you check out the Thriver School of Transformation.